Hi, everybody. We're at Pesahim, daf 76. And this is a key daf in laws of kashrut. A lot of practical things come from here. And if you're planning to study for semicha, this is a daf you need to know very, very well. So two major topics. One is mixing of hot and cold. And what wins? What's on top or what's on the bottom? In other words, if cold goes on hot or hot goes on cold, do we consider that the mixture to be something cold or something hot? And the major differences, we'll see a different opinion, 3 challenges to Shmuel, 2 proofs for Shmuel. We'll talk about something that's salted a lot with a lot of salt is considered also like hot. Heat transmits taste, and so salt does also. And that's all one topic. The second topic will be the question, how about smell? Is smell considered substance? If smell goes from one food to the other and the kind of smells like something not kosher, or the smell of milk goes into the meat because they're cooked in the same oven, is that considered actual taste, like some of the meat went into the milk or not? That's also important machloket. All right, let's review the Mishnah that we saw yesterday. It's all based on this. If you have a korban Pesach that's roasting, and it's in an oven, but it's not touching the sides of the oven. But then, what if it does? One piece of it touches the side of the oven. So you klof it mikomo. You have to peel it because in this case it was cooked not directly from the fire, but from the heat that was absorbed into the clay of the oven, and that's not permitted. That's a form of cooking. That's not barbecuing. So you don't have to throw the whole thing out. You just peel off that one slice. If some of the gravy fell onto the cheres, onto that clay side, and that now it gets hot and boiling, and now that boiling hot liquid goes back onto the korban pesach, now that section is boiled, and that will affect even more of it. You have to take off not just a peel, but you have to take off a whole section, a thicker layer. And if some of the gravy falls onto solet, some flour that's also in the oven, and then that flour is going to make that gravy is going to boil the gravy, and that gravy is korban pesach. That's korban pesach that's boiled, and so that will in turn to make the flour prohibited. So in that case, you don't have to throw out the entire bread, but just take that part of it and throw it out. The next case was the korban pesach itself. If we put oil on it, the oil was tirumah, that's fine because kohanim can eat it. But if it belongs to Israel, they're the ones that registered for it. They're not allowed to have the oil. So what are you going to do? Well, if it's raw meat is smooth, and so you can just wash off the oil, and then you can cook it, and it's fine. If it's already cooked, now cooked food is more absorbent. Certainly, if it's hot, maybe even if it's not hot. So in that case, you have to peel off the outer layer. It seems to be a case where you put the oil on after it was cooked, and so then it absorbed a little bit. If you put the oil on before it was cooked and cooked with that oil in it, that probably would be seep all the way into the meat. And then finally, there's the case of Maaseh Sheni, which just is really the same. It's not so important. This means that you can't sell it. You can't ask anybody for money. Anyone can eat the Maaseh Sheni in Jerusalem, but you just can't ask people to pay their share for it because it's your Maaseh Sheni. All right, that was the Mishnah. And now we get right into the Gemara. Itemar. Cham letoch cham. If hot food falls into cold food, like hot meat falls into hot falls into hot milk, right? So heat causes taste and substance to transfer from one food to the other. So that's a simple case. Kol asur, obviously, then it would be prohibited, both the meat and the milk. Or if it was pig that fell into a stew, right, and it was hot, both of them are hot, it's prohibited. So then the tochsonen, kol mutar, a cold meat fell into cold milk. Then it's fine. Just take it out, wash it off, and no absorption happens when it's cold. I want to see anyone actually do that. Right? Cham letoch sonen. If hot meat fell, all this is b'diavad, you can't dip it in on purpose. Hot fell into cold, or sonen letoch cham, or cold into hot. That's the subject of a machloket. Rav Amar ila agabad. He says that we follow whatever is on top. That's what's defining of the situation. So therefore, hot meat into cold water, the hot is on top. So that will cause the whole thing to be hot, and they will transfer. So it's prohibited. But cold into hot is okay because we follow the top one, and so the cold into hot is cold. Same as cold into cold is permitted. Shmuel amar tata'agabar. That is going to be the halacha l'maaseh. We say Shmuel that the bottom one is what's stronger. So therefore, hot into cold, that's okay. Cold into hot is prohibited. Scientifically, we know that heat rises. So it makes more sense that if the hot substance is on the bottom, that will rise and cause the one that's above it to become hot, and less so the other way. And that is a halacha. All right, now we're going to ask 3 challenges to Shmuel based on our Mishnah, each clause of our Mishnah. Tenan. We have the Korban Pesach, it's cooking in the oven, and it touches the side of the earthenware side of the oven, and now that it causes it to be hot, and the heat comes back. You told it mekomo, you have to take off a peel. Right now, we're assuming, for the purposes of this question, that the earthenware was cold. So now you have heat that touches cold, so that's the heat that's on top touches the cold. Maybe it's the earthenware, something underneath there. And what happens? It causes the earthenware thing to become hot, and then the earthenware that's hot will cook the Korban Pesach, not through fire. So that would be the problem. Bishlam al-Rav. This scenario then makes sense that you have to take off a peel. According to Rav, Damar ila agavad. The top one is what's defining, and in this case, it's the Korban Pesach that's going on to the cold earthenware. Mishum hachi told mekomo, and that's why the heat transfers and it cooks and causes the Korban Pesach to become prohibited. Dazal rotev beratach le la cheres, vadar cheres beratach le la rotev. Because the gravy, sorry, this is talking about the case of gravy, right? The gravy is going to cause the earthenware to become hot, and then the earthenware will in turn cook that gravy, and that gravy will then go back and touch the Pesach, and now the Korban Pesach is becoming cooked from that heat from the earthenware, and has to be only from fire and not from anything else. So that all makes sense according to Rav. Shmuel said that it's the bottom one that's defining. In this case, it's the earthenware that's on the bottom and it's cold. And so when the gravy falls onto the cold earthenware, then it should be considered all cold and doesn't get cooked. And so then it's not a problem, even if it goes back and falls back onto the Pesach. Amai told mekomo. So in that case, why do we have to take off a thick slice of the Korban? So that's the question. It seems like Shmuel's right and Rav is right, and the question challenge to Shmuel. Answer: no, you thought that the earthenware was cold, and then it would be a problem. But in fact, we're talking about where the earthenware is hot. Okay, sorry. Shmuel said besolet rotachat. That's the next case we're quoting, and so we apply that also here. That we assume that the cheres is roteach, and so therefore it's actually hot on hot. So that's why it's prohibited. Or even if it was just starting to cook, it would still be cold on hot. But it was still according to Shmuel, that would be tata'agabad, and that's why it's prohibited. All right, we resolved the first one. Now the second one, very similar. Tenan, nataf minotwala solet. If some of the gravy falls onto flour, you can just take that part of the flour, but it's prohibited. So right now we're assuming that the flour was cold. Rav says it's the upper one that's defining. Therefore, that's why you have to remove. That does cause prohibition, because what happens? The gravy is hot. That will transfer heat into the flour, right? And tata'agabar, so it does transfer heat. And now it's all mixed together. That flour, which is now hot, is going to heat up the gravy and add heat to the gravy. And that gravy now is being heated by a non-fire substance. It's boiled, and that boiled water, gravy, goes back onto the, well, even if it doesn't go back onto the animal, that itself is prohibited. Right? So even though the flour was originally cold, but the gravy will make the flour hot, and then the heat from the flour will make the gravy even hotter, and will be cooking from an external source. And that's the problem. So all that's according to Rav, who thinks that it makes sense because the gravy is hot going on to something cold, and yet it transfers. So that according to Shmuel, it says that the bottom one is defining, and in this case, the flour was cold. So the hot gravy falls onto the cold flour, but the cold flour just cools down the gravy, and it does not have heat, and does not transfer any taste, does not transfer any heat. And so if it doesn't transfer heat, then the flour is not going to further add heat to the gravy, and so the gravy never becomes prohibited, right? It's not cooked anymore. So it was only from the flame and not from anything else. So then it should be fine, and I should be able to just eat it. I shouldn't have to take part of the flour away to throw it out. The answer is no. You assumed we were talking about cold flour. Actually, the flour is hot, and that's why the gravy goes onto something hot. Shmuel says tata'agabar. So the heat of the flour will in fact cook the gravy and cause the gravy to become prohibited, because this Korban Pesach has to be only from fire. All right, we can tell that this was the original question, and Rabbi Meir Bar Shmuel answered this question first, Besol Rotachat. He actually only answered this question. And then the Gemara came and said, oh, wait, we could ask a similar question from the first case, and that's why it quoted Shmuel from the second case and said, oh, we can do the same assumption here. He already said Besol Rotachat, so too here, Becheres Rotachat. So the Gemara is out of chronological order. The second question and answer came first, and then we apply the same thing to the first question and answer. All right, and now we get to the third one. Tenan sacho b'shemen shel teruma im chaburat kohanim yochelu im shel Yisraelim chayihu yadichenu im salihu yiklof et hachison. So we put some oil onto teruma, and the kohanim can eat it. That's okay, but if it belongs to Yisrael, then if it's raw, we wash it. But if it was already cooked and then you put the oil on, you have to take off a peel. Now, why? Bishlama ledav damadila agabar ametu lehachi sagile beklipa mishum deila'a sonenhu. Rav says the top one is the prevailing one, and in this case, the oil is on top, and the oil is cold. So that's why. All you need is a kilipa, because even though it's cold, it still might absorb a little into the meat when the meat is hot, or even if it's cold but it's already cooked, so it'll absorb a little. But that's why all you need is a thin layer. But according to Shmuel, who says the bottom one prevails, so now the meat is hot, and you're putting oil onto it, so then that's really going to absorb. How come you only have to take off just a little peel? You should have to take off a whole layer, or maybe the whole thing even. It's going to enter into the entirety because it's hot. The answer, now even Shmuel would agree in this case, because oil, just put a very thin layer of oil. Right? It's barely anything. So even though it's hot, it'll only go in a little bit, and so it won't be a problem. All right, Tanya Kivatei de Shmuel. We didn't just make up this answer. We have a Braita, in fact, that supports Shmuel. So now we're going to go the other way around and support Shmuel. Cham letocham asur. Bechen sonen shenatan letocham asur. Cham letoch sonen vesonen letoch sonen madiach. So the Braita says, hot and hot, everyone agrees is prohibited. Cold into hot, or is prohibited. There you go. So cold into hot, that's Shmuel, tata agabar. And the other case is hot into cold is the same as cold into cold, and then you just have to wash it. So yeah, that's clearly the case of Shmuel. So cham letoch sonen madiach. Kevan decham hu, ad mekarle iefsha de lo bala purta. So now let's analyze more this case of hot into cold. And in the case of hot into cold, you said it's fine, just wash it. Wait a second. If something hot falls onto something cold, it's true, it's going to cool it down because the bottom one is what prevails. But in the process of cooling it down, it's impossible that some of the heat from the top one will end up making hot the bottom one also. And a little bit of taste will be absorbed. So shouldn't we at least require a peel off of it? He says, you're right. Okay. We have to revise the braita and say the last two cases are not actually the same. Cold and cold, yeah, just wash it off. But hot into cold, you do at least need a layer. So you see that they agree with each other that no matter which one's on top or bottom, that you need one layer you need to remove one layer that can transfer heat. Tannaitic, yet another braita that's going to prove Shmuel, right? We did all these challenges. This is the last proof for Shmuel. So we have hot meat into hot milk. Or cold into hot is prohibited. That's Shmuel. The bottom one prevails. Hot into cold is the same as cold into cold. And so just wash it. So clearly it's the bottom one that prevails. That's Shmuel. Now, same question as before on this braita. Really just wash it when cold goes into hot? Right, I understand that the cold one prevails and the cold one will bring down the temperature of the upper one and make it cold. But since the top one is hot, while it's cooling down, it's impossible that a little bit of that meat won't be absorbed into the milk on the bottom. So you should require, not the whole thing, but just a layer to peel off. You're right. Just add in another requirement that you're right. If it's hot into cold, it's basically okay, but you have to take off a layer. Cold into cold, you don't need anything at all. Okay, good. Amar Mor. Now this braita that we just quoted says sonen letoch sonen madiach. Cold and cold, just wash. Amar Rav Huna lo shanu ela shelo melacho. Ava melacho asur. All this, even cold into cold, is only when it's not salted. But if it's salted, it's prohibited. Why does he say that? Damar Shmuel is quoting his teacher. Maliach hareu keroteach. Kabush harehu kemevushal. As famous statements, he says, famous among those who study for semicha. Salting is like boiling, right? Salting draws out the taste, right? It makes it spicy, and that is the same effect as something that's boiling. And something that's marinated, right, or pickled is the same as something that's cooked. So if you marinate something that's permitted and prohibited in the same vinegar, right, or pickle them together for a long time, then the taste from one will in fact transfer to the other, even though it's cold. So that's an exception to the rule. Rava is commenting on this and saying and limiting it. That's only if it's so salty that's inedible. You might take fish and salt them so much just to preserve them, but when you want to come to eat them, you have to wash them off. That's what we're talking about. It has to be that salty in order to transfer. But if it's just a little table salt, as much as you would eat it that way, that's not considered salty enough to transfer taste from one to the other. And here we have a story that proves that. Mm-hmm.
Regarding the Beraita and Shmuel, or I guess Rav and Shmuel, how come in the Beraita we talk about one thing falling inside the other, but Rav and Shmuel talk about the upper and the lower? Is there a reason why there's a difference in the terminology? Or
well, they're both talking about the same case, one into the upper, and so ila'a gabar or tata'a gabar, or one into the other. So I think that the Rav and Shmuel are just conceptualizing it more and saying it instead of describing it case by case, they're giving a general rule that you can apply to every case.
Okay, I guess it would have made sense more to say like, the outer and the inner, what falls inside the other, but okay.
Right. Is it about containing? Is it about what's moving versus what's not moving, and or is it about actual elevation? So yeah, those are important questions.
Here we have a definitive proof for Shmuel. Is that what we're saying? Like we don't, the Gemara is not rejecting Rav.
That's correct. I mean, look, we had 3 challenges, but he answered them all, and we have 2 proofs for Shmuel. So yes, that's going to be the halacha. Okay, good. So now we have a couple of stories. Ahu bar gozala. One time a bird nafal lechada de chamka fell into this chamka, which is same as kutach. It's a dairy dish, right? That dairy and flour and that's fermented. That's kind of yogurt. So a bird fell into dairy. So this certain sage said, it's okay. All right, that's the story. Amar Rava, man hakim lemishnah melatakiha ilav Rav Chinena bered Rava mipashtonya. Who is so wise that can figure out how to permit such a case, except for him? Right? It's not an easy. Most sages would say it's prohibited. Right? It takes a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge of Torah in order to find a heter. Right, which is really why the great poskim are the ones that know how to find the heter. It's easy to find the chumrah. So the Gabra Rabba, he's a great person. So Amar Lach, what would he say? What would be the reason here for it to be permitted? Because it's true that this kutach dish is very strong and it's very salty, but it's still edible, right? Remember back we saw that the people in Israel thought it was unedible. It was disgusting, right? But in Bavel, this is a regular dish. So it's not salty. It's so salty that it's not edible. So it fell in. It's cold, and therefore just take it out, wash it, and it will be fine. And that's why. So he based it on that very ruling. There's only if the bird is raw, then it's the skin is smooth and they could just wash it off. But if it was roasted and then it falls in, roasted meat that is not smooth and will absorb a little bit. You just have to peel an outer layer. That's only if it didn't have cracks. But if it does have cracks, the milk will go into the cracks. And if it's spiced, then the spices also will cause the meat to absorb, and also would be prohibited. All right, that's the case. Okay, so that's all the first section about hot and cold, and then salt is also similar to hot and cold. And now we get to the question of smell. Rav is stringent and Levi is lenient. We're going to have a challenge to Levi, which we're going to turn into a challenge to Rav from the case of Pesach, and we're going to see if there's a Tannaitic dispute that matches this Amoraic dispute. Amar Rav, Besar shechuta shamen sheselao im besar nebela kachush asur. So you have kosher meat that is fatty, and you barbecued it together, not touching each other, but in the same oven with a non-kosher meat that's lean. Nevertheless, it's prohibited. For sure, the other way. The assumption is that whatever is more fatty is going to give out more taste. And so if the non-kosher is more fatty, it's going to make more smell, and those fumes will go into the other one. But Rav is saying, even if it's the other way around, even if the kosher one's fatty and the non-kosher is lean, and you might think, oh, the lean one is not giving out too much smell. No, it's still a problem. It's giving out some smell. It's going into the kosher animal, and so the kosher one is prohibited. Right? It absorbs flavor even if it's not touching. Levi amar afilu besar shechuta kachush shesila'oim besar nebela shemen mutar. This is the opposite. Even if the non-kosher one is lean and it's cooked with meat, sorry, the other way. The kosher meat is lean, and the non-kosher is fat, and therefore the non-kosher one is going to give off a lot of smell. It's nevertheless permitted. My ta'ama, why? Recha be'almahu. It's only smell, it's only aroma. Verecha lav miletahi. And that's not considered substance, right? What if you're walking by a non-kosher hot dog stand and you smell it, right? Are you prohibited? You have to hold your nose, right? No, smell is nothing. And so therefore it doesn't matter if the smell goes into the other meat, it's okay. Abed Levi Obada Be'eresh Kaduta Begdi Bedabar Acher. And it actually happened, Levi was once in the home of the exilarch, right? The rabbi in charge, the sage in charge of all the Jews in Bavel. And somehow it happened. You can't do this on purpose, but B'diavad, somehow a goat was cooked together with a pig. They didn't want to say the word pig, it's not nice. And yet Levi said, it's okay, right? It's just smell, and don't worry about it. All right, maybe his non-Jewish servants were cooking some pig at the same time. Metibe. So now we are going to ask a question. It will be a question to Levi first. And solin shene pesachim ke'echad mipenei ta'arobet. The Braita says you can't cook 2 korban pesachs in one oven because of the mixture. So it sounds like the problem is now they're both kosher. The problem is that Group A is designated to Pesach A and Group B to Pesach B, and you're not allowed to eat from someone else's Korban Pesach. And so now the mixing of flavors is going to happen if you cook them together, even if they're not touching. And so you see that this shows that smell is considered substance. My love ta'amim Levi. What are we worried about? What kind of mixing? Mixing of tastes. And so this is a problem of Levi because they're not touching, and yet smell is substantive. That's the question. No, we weren't worried about the taste, but rather about the animal themselves. Right? You're not going to recognize what your animal looks like. This one's on a spit. This one's on a spit, and you're going to put them in, take them out, and switch them around. Wait, was that number A? Was that B? And we won't know which one's which. So therefore, keep each oven separate, and you have someone that's in charge of that oven, so you won't mix up the 2 animals. And that's why everybody would have a problem with that. And in fact, this interpretation makes sense. We're not just backing into it to save Levi. This actually is the peshat of this baraita. Medikatani sefa, because keep reading to the end. Afilu gedi vetale. Even if one is a goat and one is a lamb. Both are animals that can be used for Korban Pesach, but those are obviously different. And you'll know, I sacrificed the lamb. That one's mine. So there's much less chance that you'll mix up the 2. And that's why it says, even if it's a goat and a lamb, still don't put them in one, because maybe you'll still mix it up. If you're worried about mixing up the actual animals, then it makes sense to say even a goat and a lamb that are hard to mix up, even those don't do it. If you're worried about the mixing of flavors, then it makes no difference if it's the same animal or a different animal. There's just as much of a reason to worry that the tastes are going to mix when it's the same animal as when there's 2 different animals. So the sefa would not make sense according to that first interpretation. So therefore, Levi's interpretation is correct. We're worried about the mixing of the animals. But if we're only worried about the mixing up of the animals, but the mixing of the flavors, that's not a problem. We don't worry about that at all. Oh, now that which was brought as a question to Levi, he answered so well, we turn it around, and now it's a challenge to Rav. Why aren't you worried about the mixing of flavors if you're cooking them together? No, they're in 2 different pots. They might be in the same oven, but they're in 2 different pots. What? Pots? You can't put a Korban Pesach in a pot. You can't boil it. I mean, like pots. We made some kind of enclosure around each one to keep them in separate areas, but they're both being barbecued. So that's what we're talking about. And that's why there's no smell that's going to go from one to the other. They're in separate compartments. And this is what it means. You can't put the 2 together because you might switch one animal for the other. Sorry, you can't put them together. You can't cook them together because of the mixture. What is mixture? Tarovet ta'amim, the mixture of tastes. This is Rav, and he worries about that. And even if you solve that problem and you put it in two different areas, two different sections, and so the taste won't mix, still it's prohibited. Because you might mix up the animals, and even if it's two different kinds of animals, still you might mix it up, and it's prohibited. So Rav is able to, through adding some interpretation, explain this Braita according to his own opinion as well. All right, we solved that. And last thing on the agenda is to see if Rav and Levi can actually match up with the Machloket Tanaim. Is it good or bad if it matches up with Machloket Tanaim? It actually is bad, because every Amorah would rather say, my opinion can follow all the Tanaim, right? We'd rather not have to limit them to only one. Amarav Mari. I took some bread right out of the oven, right? They bake it on the side, so I took it down, and then I let it rest on top of a barrel of wine. But the wine is tiruma. Rabbi Meir says that now you have this hot bread, and you have the wine, and now the vapor from the smell from the teruma wine is going to go into the bread, and therefore that bread can be eaten by a kohen, but is asur to everyone else. Rabbi Yehuda says it's fine. Well, we don't worry about the vapor going into the vapor of wine, taste of wine going into the bread. So you see, right? The first one would be like Rav, the second one would be like Levi. Rabbi says the third opinion, as a compromise, matir b'shel chitin. He says if it's wheat bread does not absorb, so it's okay. Oseh b'shel sorin, but barley bread does absorb the taste. Because barley draws the taste into it. Okay, so forget Rabbi Yosef. My left Tannaitic, demor sabarecha alab miltahi, demor sabarecha miltahi. So we can match this up and say that one opinion says it's not taste. That would be Rabbi Yehuda, who thinks it's permitted, and the one who says it is taste, that would be Rabbi Meir. So Rav can fit with Rabbi Meir. All right, so this seems to work, but it was a problem, right? We'd rather explain it either way. Levi v'dai tanehi. You know what, Levi? The only way Levi could make sense would be according to Rabbi Yehuda, right? There's no way, they're not touching each other. So for sure, Levi cannot be reconciled with Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yosef. Only to be Yehuda. But how about Rav? Rav, Nema Tannaitic, is Rav also? Is there any way to reconcile Rav with Rabbi Yehuda that says permitted? Yes. Amar lach Rav, dekula amarecha milita. Everyone, all the Tanaim agree that taste, smell is substance. Lavit marala dahi amar Abba bar Chana amar Resh Lakish. But regarding that Braita, we have a comment that says, "Bepat chama v'chabit pitucha dibra kol asur." Everyone, even the Yehuda, would agree that if the bread is warm and the barrel is open, then there's a lot of vapor that's going to go into the warm bread, and everyone agrees that that's prohibited. So you see, actually, even the Yehuda does agree in principle that that smell is substantive. So he agrees with Rav. The only reason they disagree is because they're not all talking about that case. If it's cold bread and the barrel is closed, everyone agrees, fine, no vapor is going to go in. The whole machloket is either if the bread is warm and the barrel is closed, even though the barrel is closed, it's made out of wood, it has cracks in it, so some vapor goes in and the warm bread will draw it in. That's the machloket. Or patsonenet v'chabit petucha, or if the barrel is open, a lot of vapor, even if it's cold, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't absorb. So machloket was not in between case, but our case that we were talking about with the korban Pesach, right, or two things being cooked together in the same oven, that is clearly like an open casket and hot bread. And so that's why even the Yehuda would agree in the standard case that we were talking about that is prohibited. The only reason he says okay here is because something is closed or it's cold. Good, so he's able to resolve that. Taneh Rav Kana bered Rav Chinena Saba Pacha Fa'a Im Sali Batanur Asur Lochla Bekuteha. Okay, so one more law about the smell. If you took bread and cooked it with meat in the same oven, right? So bread and meat in the same oven, you're not allowed to take that bread and eat it with dairy. because the bread is fine, it's kosher because it's kosher meat, but you can eat it by itself or with meat. You can't mix it with dairy, so it absorbs some of the taste of the meat. So there you go. He agrees that there's something to the substance. That is going to be the halacha l'maaseh. Reach is in fact like substance.
What about meat and dairy if they're both in covered pots in the same oven?
Right. So then that Shulchan Aruch says that that's okay because
But
they're
open
covered.
would be not good.
Because they're covered, so then
Yeah.
the steam, then the smell does not go out. But if they're open, then that's exactly this case. It would be a problem.
Okay.
Some fish was roasted together with meat. They weren't touching. One smelled, got the vapor from the other, and he said that you're not allowed to have it with dairy. So it's fish, right? So same thing, either meat or fish cooked with meat. And now one last halacha, more bere de bar Rav Asher amar afilu b'milcha nami asura mishum dekashel recha al dvar acher. This meat, this fish that you cooked with meat, even to eat it with salt, in other words, even to eat it alone, is prohibited. If you cooked fish with meat, you cannot eat the fish even by itself. Why? Because it's bad. It's not good for bad breath. Cause bad breath, and for something else unspeakable. Commentaries say that means talking about sara'at. So this can cause disease. So this is unhealthy and just nobody will want to be near you. So therefore, do not eat meat that's cooked with. Do not eat fish that's cooked with meat. Okay, so that's the source of that halacha regarding fish and meat. So we saw, right, these really cases that come up all the time. And just to give one example, if you're making coffee on Shabbat with milk, right? So if you put the milk first, that's cold, and then the hot coffee after, that's okay because the milk is on the bottom. So you say tata'a gabar, right? However, if you had hot coffee, let's say it's from in a kli rishon, right? Something that was that's directly on the fire, and you put milk into it that's cold onto hot, and then the hot would warm up the milk, and that would be a problem. Most of our cases, we don't do that. We put it into a mug first, so it's already kli sheni. So you put the cold into kli sheni, but kli sheni and no mevashel, and so that would be okay. So in most cases, we don't have to worry about that. But we did see that even hot onto cold, it still can transfer a little bit of heat, which means that if you just put a tiny bit of milk and then a lot of hot water on it straight from boiling thing, then that could be a problem. So anyway, milk first or coffee first, this is, you see a huge debate. It will depend on all of the factors that we discussed here. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, amen.